Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Perchuk, Deputy Director of the Getty Research Institute, and I'm happy to welcome you to LA Activism, the Institute of Cultural Inquiry's AIDS Chronicles 1994 to 2019. First, we would like to acknowledge that the land Getty inhabits today was once known as Tamangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people, as well as all First People, past, present, and future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabriel Tongva community. We invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us in caring for it. The Los Angeles-based One Institute, the oldest active LGBTQ+ organization in the United States, which has just turned 70, happy birthday, has long been Getty's partner on Pacific Standard Time, now PST Art. But the collaboration on this event is an exciting deepening of this partnership. We are bringing you this program within the framework of One's Circa Festival, the first festival of queer history in this country. This event is also intended to celebrate the generous donation of the Institute of Cultural Inquiry's records to Getty by its members. The ICI was an artist space with a long history in West Los Angeles, and today the conversation between Deborah Cullen-Morales, Antoinette LaFarge, and our own Pietro Rigolo will focus on the AIDS Chronicles, a monumental project by the ICI, 25 years in the making, which reflects on memory and awareness, as well as erasure of the HIV/AIDS epidemic from the media and therefore from public consciousness. As an institution devoted to the study and understanding of art history and visual culture, we strongly believe in the power of archives as testimony and record of history. And we are honored to be taking care of these important and beautiful works of the ICI, which are also a lasting document of the many lives lost to the virus and to the deeply problematic response to the epidemic. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Tony Valenzuela, Executive Director of One Institute, for some remarks on the festival prior to our conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. I am Tony Valenzuela, the Executive Director of One Institute, which, as Andrew said, is the oldest operating LGBTQ+ organization in the country, founded here in Los Angeles in 1952. One Institute elevates queer and trans histories and embraces emerging stories through collaborative education, arts, and cultural programs. So to celebrate over 70 years of service to queer and trans communities, One Institute is now midway through hosting Circa, a month-long LA County-wide Queer Histories Festival, which, as Andrew said, is a first in the nation. I'd like to thank the sponsors of the Circa Festival, which are the California Humanities, 3rd District Supervisor Lindsay Horvath, LA County Department of Arts and Culture, the City of West Hollywood, and California Arts Council. So I'm very excited about today's conversation, the Institute of Cultural Inquiry's AIDS Chronicles 1994 to 2019. I'll now pass this over to Pietro Rigolo with the Getty Research Institute. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here today. My name is Pietro Rigolo. I am an associate curator at the Getty Research Institute and will have the pleasure to moderate our discussion tonight. First of all, I want to thank Tony Valenzuela and all the staff at the One Institute for putting together this timely festival and for allowing us to be a part of it. Working with One on this have been a great experience, and we are honored to be part of this series of events. Today, we will discuss the AIDS Chronicles, a project carried out by the Institute of Cultural Inquiry, ICI, in Los Angeles over about 25 years. As Andrew mentioned, we at the Getty Research Institute are now the repository of that history and the wonderful artworks that were produced as part of it, as the records of the Institute were generously donated to us by its members. We will talk about the AIDS Chronicles with two cultural producers who were deeply involved in the project, Deborah Cullen-Morales and Antoinette LaFarge. I will briefly present them now, then I will leave the mic to them for about 20 minutes, and then we will open it up with a conversation where we will try to answer as many questions from you as possible. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box at any time. So, Antoinette LaFarge is an artist and writer based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, whose visual work has taken form as computer-mediated performances, programmed installations, and digital prints. Recent art projects include Deep Earth of 2021 and Burn in Time of 2018. She is the author of Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation, 2021, and Louise Brigham and the Early History of Sustainable Furniture Design of 2019. And she is the co-editor of the forthcoming anthology At the Margins, Experimental Engagements in Science, Literature, and the Arts, that will be published by Brill next year. Antoinette is a professor emerita of new media art at UC Irvine. Deborah Cullen-Morales is a program officer for arts and culture at the Mellon Foundation. Previously, Deborah served as executive director of the Bronx Museum of the Arts, director and chief curator of the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia University, director of curatorial programs at El Museo del Barrio, and curator of the print collection at Robert Blackburn's printmaking workshop. Her work focuses on modern and contemporary Latinx, Caribbean, and African American art, and she is currently co-editing the anthology, A Handbook of Latinx Art, for the University of California Press. Deborah, Antoinette, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pietro, and thank you everybody who made this event possible for us to be here. I'm going to start out by just talking very briefly about the ICI itself, and I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully this will go smoothly. So the ICI is an artist-run nonprofit that has a more than 30-year history now. Its focus has been on research and residencies rather than exhibitions. But it does have a few public-facing kinds of events, one of which has been its annual AIDS Day, World AIDS Day events in connection with the AIDS Chronicles, which we will talk about. It has, as you can see on the screen, we had a research library and a series of collections of things like ephemera, some of which are now in the collection of the Getty. One of our major public-facing activities was through the ICI Press, which published half a dozen books and a number of pamphlets over the years. And then we had a number of long-running special projects, some small, some large-scale, the AIDS Chronicles being the very largest of these. And so Deb is going to begin by describing a little bit about the AIDS Chronicles for us.
Thanks, Antoinette, for navigating us on the PowerPoint, and welcome everyone. And thanks to the Getty and to One for having us. So the Institute's mission was to focus on visual technologies and how they're used to document, imagine, remember, and conceal the convergence of human activities and the capabilities that we call culture. So since we're here today to talk about the AIDS Chronicles, I'd like to tell you a little bit about them before we get into specific presentations and years. The AIDS Chronicles were initiated in 1993 at the height of the AIDS pandemic in the United States. And the urge was to create a record of the day-to-day discourse on AIDS and HIV in what is often thought of as the US paper of record, the New York Times. The goal of the project was simple. It was to subvert the newspaper's usual hierarchy of focus in a way that narrows the reader's attention to just one issue, the newspaper's reporting, or lack thereof, around the spread of the HIV virus and the global AIDS pandemic. Each yearly Chronicles then consisted of 365 front pages from the New York Times, collected from December 1st, or World AIDS Day, to November 30th of the following year. The pages were treated on both sides with 3 layers of paint to produce these very tangible blood red sheets, as you see one example here on the screen, and to leave visible only the images or articles that mentioned AIDS or HIV, along with the folio showing the date of the publication and the obituaries heading in the newspaper's index as a direct reference to the listing of the AIDS-related deaths deep inside the newspaper. The bound editions of the Chronicles were on permanent display in the ICI library in Los Angeles, and they were taken out and shown publicly on December 1st in a day-long ritual commemorating World AIDS Day and the Day Without Art. Once the pages were all painted and prepared, they were bound by an artist that was commissioned, and a different artist was commissioned each year.
I just want to mention too that in the early years, there was so much stigma around HIV and AIDS deaths that they often weren't reported as such by families. And so we always left the obituaries byline visible on the front page, even if we couldn't confirm that there were AIDS deaths listed on that day's New York Times, because in fact, people were dying every day, whether it was being reported as such or not. We did a quick timeline to just give you a sense of when and how this all happened. AIDS was really identified and became, by the Centers for Disease Control, became a subject of public conversation in that way in about 81. The AIDS quilt comes in 6 years later, Day Without Art a couple days after that. We did our first AIDS-related project, which I'm not going to talk about at any length, the AIDS Bottle Project, starting in 1990. And did that for a number of years in parallel with the AIDS Chronicles. That also was a combination memorializing and educational project. And then there was an intervention that we did in 92, but the 93-94 year was really the first full year of collecting and painting and displaying the AIDS Chronicles. And then, of course, in 2021, it was collected by the Getty Research Institute, for which we are extremely grateful.
So I just need to put my art historian hat on for a minute and set the artistic context for the moment into which these projects were born. And I want to briefly mention that at the time of the birth of the Bottle Project and the Chronicles, there was an outpouring of artwork that raged, mourned, and advocated for action and for more attention to be paid to this crisis. So the Chronicles were not alone in this. In addition to the AIDS Memorial Quilt that Antoinette just mentioned, and other activities that came out of ACT UP, including the Silence Equals Death Project and Grand Fury, Root Material, and others, I want to bring to the table here Kiki Smith, particularly her 12 empty glass bottles that were plated and etched with the name of 12 bodily fluids. And the substances ranging from life-sustaining things like milk and blood, also referred to disease-bearing substances such as pus, mucus, vomit, and evoked very powerful emotions when it was first exhibited. As well, Felix Gonzalez Torres was installing his first world portraits. Here we can see an installation he did for visual aids at the Brooklyn Museum on December 1st, on one of the first Day Without Art. And his sort of portrait here implies personal moments, color memories, and then the casual inclusion of the word interferon refers to his status living with AIDS, and also recalls the importance of medical breakthroughs in this moment. Next. I also want to just bring to the table with us some other artists who are working with very charged material, specifically blood at this time, and the sort of the high charge that blood had at the moment, including Andres Serrano, who did a whole series of photographs with blood and other substances, and performance artists, including most notoriously the Los Angeles artist Ron Athey, whose particular performance in 1994 became part of the culture wars when he used when he did some cuttings on the back of a collaborator in the performance, Divinity Fudge, and then made a human printing press out of him and aired the paper towels into the audience. There was just this widespread anxiety about the transmission of AIDS, and combined with a broad unfamiliarity of S&M context, we just sort of fueled this agitation around AIDS, and the art world responded by wanting to activate. Next. And I just want to bring to the table, because this will come back later, the very important work by Robert Farber, Every 10 Minutes. Farber dedicated his work to addressing the AIDS crisis, and he became very well known for this audio recording in which a bell tolls every 10 minutes, representing the 1991 statistic in which every 10 minutes someone was dying in that moment of HIV or AIDS. The recording was made in the bell tower of Riverside Church in New York, and it was widely disseminated by visual aids for the first day without art. And it was presented numerous times in numerous spaces. And this work would become very important also to the ICI. And with the permission of his estate, we took to eventually updating this every year with the new statistics and doing a new version of the bell toll, which of course was getting more and more rapid. Over to you, Antoinette.
Okay, I'm just going to mention briefly the AIDS bottle projects, a series of bottles that we created specifically to remember artists and other people connected with the art world, like curators who had died of AIDS. Each bottle had the name and a short bio of the artist on the lid, and then objects were placed inside the bottle to connect whoever owned the bottle with that person. Anything could be put in the bottle that the person wanted. And we took these around to various spaces, often colleges and universities. And the idea was people would take them home with them. They were freely given out so that people could then have them as memorials of artists, but also as a way to channel any grief they were feeling from people they were losing in their own community. And one of the things that was really central to what we were doing with the Bottle Project was creating conversations in safe spaces around a topic that people were finding very, very hard to talk about in public because of the extraordinary stigma around a disease, which in the Reagan years was associated with things that a lot of people had decided were evil, like homosexuality, drug use, and so on. So that was very much a conversationally oriented memorial project. And I thought I would also talk just a little bit about how we did each year's Chronicles. As Deborah said, we would collect an entire year's worth of front pages, and then we would, sometime during the year, we would start the process of reading the front page to see if there were any AIDS articles that year. They would be circled, and so they would be saved out. And then each page would be painted on each side with 3 layers of paint, a transparent layer to protect the paper, and then a black layer and a red layer. So that's 6 layers of painting, which is itself is extraordinarily time consuming, times 365 pages. And we had to set up, as you can see at the right, a spreadsheet approach to tracking missing pages that were partially done, which ones had been read, which ones had images, because it's extraordinarily easy to get lost in the process. All of this was done by the ICI's core group of affiliated people who are called associates, and a larger group of volunteers, which changed every year. Here you can see pages in process. On the right, you have the ones with the clear gel drying, and then the ones on the left are very near completion. You can see there, as you will see going forward, there are not many AIDS articles in most years on the front page of the New York Times.
So this was our first presentation of the AIDS Chronicles, and you can see it was together with the Bottle Project. And it was sort of a guerrilla installation that we did in the art history classroom at City University of New York Graduate Center for 1 week, testing to see how it would work to hang the pages and how people would react to them. Next. And then eventually we would perfect the process of creating all the pages, and then we commissioned artists to bind the covers, as we mentioned. So this is the first commissioned artist cover by the New York-based artist Esteban Chavez. And the year's pages were, as Antoinette mentioned, collected and communally prepared by ICI and volunteers. So there were a dozen or more people working on the pages over the years. And then the artist decided, in this case, we gave him all the pages, and he decided to hand sew the edges of the pages all together in 12 different accordion books, one for each month of the year, and then created 4 portfolios of prints to contain each season. So the entire year consisted of four volumes of prints that were created at the printmaking workshop, Robert Blackburn's printmaking workshop in New York, where both he and I were working at the time. Next. And then this is the presentation of that volume in the lobby of the New Museum of Contemporary Art when it was on Broadway on Day Without Art, December 1st, 1995. We were able to do it in the lobby so that people passing by on the street were able to also see what was happening and bear witness to the turning of the pages. The pages were turned with the tolling of the bell, the Robert Farber project that I mentioned earlier. And the Chronicles were turned throughout the day that the new museum was open on that Day Without Art by ICI associates, volunteers, and persons who showed up who wanted to participate. You can see in this image, Robert Blackburn, who ran the printmaking workshop, was there at that time the photo was taken.
We're going through this now roughly in chronological order, although we'll be skipping some years. 96, this is a presentation we did outside the Midnight Special bookstore in Santa Monica. We tried to find places where there would be diverse traffic, a cross-section of people who would come by and encounter the AIDS Chronicles. We didn't, for that reason, mostly want to put it in galleries and museums. So bookstores were one possible choice. Colleges, as you're going to see, are another choice.
This was the 1995 pages were gathered into a clamshell portfolio and wrapped with a ribbon. I did the wrapping that year and wrote the names of the obituaries on the ribbon. And when we tied the year shut in an event that we held that year at the ICI headquarters in Los Angeles, again, to the tolling of the bell, we ceremonially tied the year closed and bound the books in that way.
So this year was a year in which we decided to do this as a quilt. I shouldn't say we actually. This approach to making the AIDS Chronicles was largely, if not solely, the idea of Lisa Patt, who was the ICI's founder. She died in 2019. And the AIDS Chronicles is largely her brainchild, and the rest of us are people who supported it and furthered it in every way we could over the years. So this was meant to reference the AIDS quilt, obviously, as well as take another approach to dealing with the question of newsprint and 365 pages. Technically, this was a really complicated project because think about how difficult it would be to knit newspaper. It falls apart. It had to be cut into strips, and then each strip had to be folded over string and glued, and it took an enormous amount of experimentation to begin to make this. It exists, unfortunately, in an unfinished form because Lisa died before she could finish it. But it is, even in its unfinished form, quite an extraordinary physical object. One of the more unusual of the AIDS Chronicles. There are a few others we'll see that take a different form from the painted red pages, but this is certainly one of them. This year was the year in which the volumes were bound by Gary H. Brown. This also was the first year in which the New York Times started printing color photographs, a trivial detail of the newspaper history. And this year also included about 50 AIDS articles, which is an extremely high number. Most years it was between, I would say, 1 and 2 dozen that you would have. He dedicated his project to a friend and fellow artist, John Bomber Murphy, who had died of AIDS complications. And again, we have 4 volumes, each one named for and representing a season, 3 months worth of pages.
This is the 1998 presentation, and it was bound, if you will, by photographer and woodworker Carl Peterson, who was inspired by the traditional newspaper reading sticks found in public libraries. And so he bound the prepared pages to 12 different reading sticks, and then created a rack to hold them. So we felt that it was appropriate in that year to present it on the sidewalk in front of the main branch of the New York Public Library. And in this case, we had a gong that kept up with the tolling of the bell as we turned the pages all day long.
The following year's edition was by artist Pam Posey, and what she did to represent the total number of AIDS deaths that year in the United States was to pierce holes throughout the pages, 17,000 some odd tiny punched holes that kind of create this constellation of missing people in this edition. This is a 2-volume edition that Pam Posey made with hand-drawn covers. And this is by the artist Deborah Paulson. Both of them are LA-based artists, and for her Chronicles, she chose to feature the DNA double helix on the cover, because that was the year that the sequencing of the human genome was completed. And I say that in quotation marks because they're still working on it and refining it. And that was an important milestone in the continuing history of AIDS and HIV research. Here's another one of the Chronicles that takes a very unusual form. In this year, Martin Gantman, another LA artist, decided to take all of the front pages that did not have AIDS articles and burn them in a ceremony at the Institute of Cultural Inquiry. And then the ashes were housed in this coffin-like coffer that he created, metal coffer that you see at upper left, and alongside this cylinder that you see at lower left, in which the AIDS articles were preserved we tried always to make sure that the AIDS articles from those front pages were visible in one form or another, were saved in one form or another, no matter how the project was done. That was one of the through lines. His idea of burning the Times was to honor not only the deaths from AIDS that year, but also the deaths from 9/11, which had struck everybody's hearts that year. And he was also thinking about the kind of 2001, we already were beginning to see the impending death of print newspapers. They were beginning to have a hard time coping. There were still major consolidations and closures still to come, but there was a sense that the era was turning and that print itself might be vanishing from our culturescape. In 2003, we did a giant retrospective exhibition in the San Francisco Gallery in Santa Monica with along the wall the loose pages from the 2003 edition, and then some of the earlier bound editions that you've just seen photographs of on tables where people could examine them and get a sense of, this is the first time we really displayed this as something that had its own history, as opposed to only referencing the history of the larger culture. This exhibition also included a spoken word performance by the artist Jay Todd as part of the events. I often helped, as I did this year, to paint and hang the Chronicles, but I was often teaching on December 1st. Sadly, so I would sometimes miss these events, and as it happened, this is one of the years I was not able to be there for the Day of Art, the Day Without Art itself, sadly. And then this year's 2003's pages were loose leaf pages were housed in these reliquary boxes made by the Bay Area artist Crystal Dilboni. And this year, 2004, is actually one that I have been working on. I was commissioned to do this one. And being a digital media artist, I decided to make a purely digital edition, hand painted in a digital drawing program. And I'm redrawing and repainting the photographs and articles with the idea of using the abstraction of drawing to try to bring into focus some of the sort of tropes of representation that you often see in photographs that can be obscured in photographs because they seem so natural to our eyes. By this year, much of the coverage on the front pages is for the international AIDS crisis, which has obviously been growing in parallel with the US crisis, but is becoming ever larger. And also at this period, we were still in a phase where many people around the world were not able to access HIV medicines or treatments or preventions. And we were beginning to see an enormous spread of AIDS into wider populations. So there's a lot of coverage in this year of international AIDS. And its spread. This is going to be the last bit remains to be finished. It actually is designed to become an animation, not a physically printed object.
So now we're going to whip through some slides so we can get to the conversation, because I think we're going a little. So we're just going to show you a few more of the presentations. This is the 2005 installation at the AIDS headquarters in Los Angeles.
ICI headquarters.
ICI, sorry. Sorry, things switching that. This is the 2008 installation at the Kirchhoff Gallery at UCLA. This is the binding of the 2010 edition by Haitian artist Vladimir Sibyl Charlier, who's based in New York. And this year obviously was in reference as well to the Haitian earthquake. As well as the crates that came for aid, as well as coffins to AIDS victims. And there was like a beautiful sort of resonance inside the binding of the sequins for both Haitian voodoo flags, but sort of a celebratory coffin or altar for the 2010 Chronicles.
And this is actually the other digital edition, and the first one that was completed, and it was made available for online viewing via the issue website. The covers of the virtual editions have images of electromicroscopic photographs of active HIV infections. There is a physical box and a physical element to this, but it was mainly intended as a digital magazine version of the AIDS Chronicles. And that is where we stop.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antoinette and Deborah, for such an insightful presentation. I'm pulling a few questions that I have, and I invite again everybody, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box, because we would like to hear from you. So for me, coming to this project, so many years after, it is such a wonderful example of solidarity, alliance, and community building that the ICI sought in response to that particular crisis and that moment in history. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the reactions you gathered from the very specific group of artists you were working with and commissioned the yearly artist intervention, as well as from the broader public you were presenting the Chronicles to each year, and how you feel like those reactions sort of changed over time.
Well, I can start by saying, as Antoinette mentioned, we always sought to do it in a more public realm so that people encountering it weren't, necessarily a purely arts audience. And although most of the people who participated in the project were in some way related to the arts, a lot of people weren't necessarily artists. And I think from my perspective, having participated in a number of the presentations of the Chronicles, the broad public, I think, didn't know what it was and was drawn in by the sound of the bell or the gong, and then wanted to see more and wanted to learn. And I think we always tried to have information also about testing, safe sex, resources that you could access if that was of interest to you, as well to have the most recent statistics on hand so people were aware as the years went by that the pandemic was not over and it was affecting more and more and different, different groups of society, and that we all needed to take responsibility for that. Occasionally there were angry responses, but I'd say for the most part, I found people, wanting to learn and be educated. Antoinette, how did you find the response?
I would say that from the artist and making side, we met nothing but enthusiasm. I would say every artist I knew was aware from early on that we were losing enormous numbers of people from our community, and people wanted to do something that could honor that. We never were short of volunteers and people to commission covers from the audience. I was actually trying to think about the audience side of things. I feel that because it was public, whereas the AIDS bottles tended to be smaller gatherings in a room somewhere, and conversations flowed more easily for that reason. My memory is that I didn't always have conversations with people on the streets and where the Chronicles were. I think it was hard for people, especially in the early years, to talk about this stuff publicly. But the beauty of the Chronicles as an object, the page turning as a ritual, and the gong sounding, it was like a speaking object situation. People could come up to it. They could stop at just appreciating it and stopping to think about it. They could take part in the page turning, which didn't require anybody to talk about anything, anybody to have a position on AIDS that they would say out loud. And then if they felt at that point comfortable, then they could step aside and talk to one of us. And so then we did have some good conversations with people. But so there were several stages of engagement. And then, of course, anyone who couldn't cope with the idea of thinking about AIDS and HIV would just walk on. And so I liked that there were this staged way that you could engage with the Chronicles.
And if I can just add too, I think for us, like thinking about the making side of it, for us and all the people who came to volunteer, which were, many different people over the years, everyone had a different relationship to the pandemic, interaction with people very close or sometimes further away. And it was really time consuming, as Antoinette also mentioned. But I think I found it, and I think some others that I spoke to found it as a moment for us to allow ourselves time to think and talk amongst ourselves too about what we were doing, how we were responding, where we were in our lives, because it was a very meditative process, because it was durational too in its making. So.
Well, Deborah, since you mentioned the actual making of it and how time consuming it was, we have a question actually about that by an anonymous attendee who asked, can you elaborate on the process? Were the article masked off? Was the specific color made specifically for this project? So if you can talk a little bit more about this kind of more
Yeah,
technical aspect of the making.
Sure. I don't know if you were able to see it from the PowerPoint or not. No, nothing was masked. I mean, not really masked off. We did almost everything freehand. You know, people gained different skills over the years of doing it, or had different skills, came to the project with different skills, and some could really do that straight line with along the folio, and some could not. And but there was a place for everybody to participate and be part of it. It was almost all done freehand. We did, you know, find and circle the articles just so we didn't paint them out. The color, we had a color that we kind of worked towards. That is why I brought sort of Andres Serrano and Ron Athey and others who work with blood to the table. I mean, there was a very visceral, bodily, fleshy, bloody color to it, but it was mixed. Also freehand every year, so they vary. If you look at them over the years, they really vary. And they were done in different places, you know. Some of us were in New York, some were in Los Angeles, some were in other places, and so we prepared them and shipped them around the country. So they vary all very slightly, and the pages themselves change size over the years. Like the New York Times changed its size, so the volumes change size. So they were all very handmade. Antoinette, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that the one of the crucial steps was that first clear gel layer to protect the newspaper, because newspaper, as you know, starts to crumble within only a couple of years. So there's the three layers of paint actually create a kind of a slightly more enduring object.
Right. I was also wondering, you know, thinking about how this project can also be read, of course, as a reflection on the news media and the way they always necessitate new hot content, right? And end up disregarding over time issues that do not have an immediate solution. So in a way, by focusing on the coverage of a single problem for over 25 years, you saw how you show how such a horrible epidemic and the catastrophic response by the government slowly actually stopped being a news item. And another interesting point is the fact, as you, Antoinette, mentioned, the fact that your project evolved during the most dramatic change in the news industry itself, with the coming of the internet and the progressive demise of the actual newsprint. So I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on these changes and tell us maybe what lessons would you say you learned about how we produce, how we seek out, and how we consume news in this country?
Two things come to mind. One is that I remember having conversations with Lisa several times about how long the Chronicles should run. What should it be, 15 years? Should it be 20 years? She eventually decided on 25. I'm not entirely sure why, except that quarter of a century is a lovely phrase. But part of that was this feeling that the way in which people were learning about AIDS and thinking about it was in fact migrating away from the New York Times. And yet at the same time, the elites of this country still do see it as the paper of record. And so I think that was one of her reasons for wanting to continue it a few years longer. On a practical level, we started running into difficulties with the slow shift to digital, because every year we would lose a few pages, 365 pages, and so we would have to get back orders, and they became increasingly hard to get hold of as the New York Times started locking up its archives and locking up things behind paywalls. So we ended up actually having to print out a few pages of our own on newsprint just to get things in the right dimensions, because the archives became seriously difficult to deal with. So there was the whole paywall issue that started to get in the way. It wasn't just enough to have it delivered to your door every week. So those were two issues that I know kind of cropped up during that transition era. I think also that's one of the impetuses behind that final chronicle I showed you that was on issue. Lisa was thinking about ways in which the Chronicles could be made visible in other fora besides through these wonderful physical objects that we've been making.
And maybe I'll just add to that too. I mean, as we all started to get our, information and media more easily to our fingertips, from global sources. I mean, I think all along there was the inclination to connect to, other events in the year, like September 11th or the Haitian earthquake or some other kinds of events.
Zika virus, yeah.
Zika virus, right? Exactly. There was years where things connected, but I think as we more easily, and had things at our global fingertips, I think there was a sort of rethinking too, in a way, perhaps about, is this the right form? Is this the right project? Do we continue this project? I know early on at one point, I said, how long are we doing this for? And we decided until the problem was solved, right? So we failed on that account.
Right. We have a question somewhat on these lines by Zachary Torres, who's asking, I wonder, as the demographic of HIV positive populations continue to shift out of the urban north to the American south and continues to expand in non-Western nations, if there has been any initiative to exhibit the Chronicles in cities outside of the New York City, LA area, or even outside of the USA, and if so, how would this shift the project's goals and meanings?
That's actually a great question. I will start by saying, I mean, and I know this is like a complex chronology, and even us, as we were going back and preparing for this, like some of the chronology even to us is a little unclear, but I think we were thinking about on the 25th anniversary doing a big presentation that should be in various locations and how that would be received, and maybe that would be a moment to rethink some things. And unfortunately, as Antoinette mentioned, our founder and director, Lisa Pat, passed away unexpectedly. So I think instead of thinking towards a 25th anniversary presentation, we decided it was time to close it and place it at the Getty instead. But that would be an opportunity to rethink or reframe, or an invitation to others perhaps to consider that.
I think also that the focus on the New York Times did keep it somewhat North American centric. We did talk about trying to take it out of the country a couple of times, but it seemed like there was perhaps more interest in possibly partnering with somebody who would want to do a parallel project with a local newspaper of record that kind of created a dialogue between two different cultures, two different approaches to newspaper coverage, rather than trying to simply export or move the New York Times centric one around the world. But part of it is logistical. All of us had full-time jobs and were trying to do all of this as volunteer work on the side. And every year, that I have to say, nearly every year, there was a bit of a scramble to figure out where we could take it in time, and would we have the pages painted in time, and if not, what would we do instead? We were always behind on this project. It was not at all a simple project to keep going, and so the placing it in public was actually always one of the more difficult things, just because of the extra time and logistics required.
Right. There's another question about this idea of kind of overlapping crisis, or the project embracing other events happening in the world. From another anonymous attendee who's asking, could you talk about the thinking around connecting current life loss events in some years, like 9/11 and the Asian earthquake, to the ongoing AIDS loss, in relation to the power of staying instead focused on people exhaustion or the normalization of the AIDS loss? Was the thinking done by the artists doing the work that specific year, or were there guidelines by the overall group?
No, there weren't guidelines. I think that in each case, this was a response by the individual artist, and it comes out of, for your year, you often are reading all of the pages. You're sharing some of the reading, but you're always aware of which are the pages that have the AIDS articles, and you end up seeing a lot of the year's headlines and getting a feeling for the other disasters that are looming that year. And so I think what happened was that individual artists, for various reasons of their own, connected to one specific tragedy or another, and they basically brought it into the project generally as a kind of a ghost. It was there, but at a very subliminal level, because it was important to all of us to keep the focus on AIDS. Sarah, Deborah, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I'd add, Antoinette, is you know, when you were done preparing the year and you looked back over, when you were reading and you looked back over the year and the mentions, I mean, keeping the focus on AIDS or HIV, I mean, that was kind of the only rule. It was like, if it mentioned AIDS or HIV, we kept it. But it was often like an incredibly frivolous mention. Like, it was often not a hard-hitting article about new advancements and, you know, treatments or whatever, or, you know, money pouring into research, right? I mean, it was often like a very frivolous sideways mention. So yeah, that was, I just want to note that, because I often found that, you know, like you might see, oh, there's several articles this year, but when you went in and read them, it was still an utter silence, you know.
Right. We have another question from Madison Hernandez, who's asking, what is your personal connection to this work? Why do you find it important? I guess this question could be for me as well, and maybe I can say something and then leave it to you. I mean, for me personally, as a curator of modern and contemporary art at the GRI, I'm very interested in this project because, you know, overall we're working very hard in trying to document the art scene, you know, internationally, nationally, but then also more specifically the LA art scene. And I find this particular project really, really important within the context of what was going on in LA in the 1990s and in the 2000s. I'm also working on an exhibition project that will be a collection survey, essentially highlighting the presence and the contribution of queer artists and their allies in our collection, in our archives. So I think, you know, the AIDS Chronicle would be an important part of my show, although, you know, the show will not all be about the HIV/AIDS epidemic, of course, but I would like the show to be also more, you know, somewhat uplifting and celebratory and not only focus on that. Deborah, Antoinette, you want to add something from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll just go back to, you know, as I sort of tried to frame up front through the, like, my art historian background, when the pandemic began to transpire and we understood what was happening, and you know, with the advent of AIDS activism and art that came out of it, with ACT UP, etc., there were various manifestations of ways that people tried to you know, bring attention in their own way to the crisis in the pandemic, and you know, what was happening, you know, personally and communally and nationally and internationally. And I personally just found it a way to engage with that discourse.
Mm-hmm.
That holds true for me as well. And I would add that coming out of the 80s, I had, like a lot of other artists, a lot of free-floating anger about the culture, the Reagan culture, and the ways in which the arts in general were being dismissed, denigrated, and defunded. And I have always had a very strong avant-garde sensibility. And one of the things I'm aware of is that those channels in art in America are not actually well covered in the newspaper of record. So I'm not the biggest fan of the New York Times anyway. And so it was very easy for me to want to be part of a project that was designed to look carefully at what the New York Times was doing in a visual way, that as a a project that becomes a visual research. But I'm certain I was channeling some of my anger about a lot of other things that were going on in the culture at the time. So it became a kind of place for intersectional anger and sorrow to come loose. And then for both Deborah and I, and also all the other ICI associates, I won't say it was important, but it was always something we wanted to do, was to support Lisa in her visions for the ICI.
And it was a way for us to come together, I think, in that moment, especially early on, and have that time together, which was kind of quiet time, but it was also, reflective and angry and sad and productive.
Right. So we still have 3-4 minutes before we close our program, but I'm so happy we receive all these questions. So maybe let's try speed it up and answer them all. We still have a couple. One, it's pretty interesting actually, and I never thought about asking you. It's from another anonymous attendee who's asking, did the New York Times actually ever cover the project or any other legacy media outlets?
I told Antoinette we were going to get asked that question. To my knowledge, no. And at one point we were thinking the perfect place to do the 25th anniversary presentation would be in the New York Times lobby, but we never contacted them. The project is critical of their work. So
yeah.
Yeah. Another anonymous attendee is asking, the importance of theatricality in activism, especially AIDS activism, seems central to this project. Could you speak to the role of theatricality in the AIDS Chronicles project and perhaps the Institute more broadly in its cultural critique?
Antoinette, that's you.
Well, we've talked a little bit already about how the Chronicles were presented in a performative way, with the page turning at the interval, slow interval, and the ringing of the gong at the interval of AIDS deaths that year. So that there would be a kind of a ritual quality to it, and so, but in a very simple way that invites people to take part, not to intimidate people, since it's a scary subject already. There are the ICI does have a history of doing other things that are relate to performance, and those are of a very different nature, so I don't think it's worth going into them now. I think with a lot of activism, the important performativity happens around the media. It's like you're basically designing your actions and your responses so that you will get the right kind of coverage in the press. I would not say that was the Institute's forte. We were never really sure if we were going to get covered by anybody, and we didn't seek out that kind of coverage either, to my knowledge, although I know that the ICI always sent out press releases and so on. But if in thinking about the theater of the enactments, we were always thinking, I think, more about how the random people that we were going to present the Chronicles to and with, how they could engage with it and with us. By the way, there was one photograph I meant to mention it as we sped by. I'll just say quickly, we often, when we went into public with any of our projects, wore white lab coats, sort of to signal that we were researchers and not just random people, and also make us easy to identify. We had little name tags on our coats. So we ourselves kind of put on a bit of a lab scientist researcher costume in order to be out in the public.
Right. Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time and we need to wrap things up, but we received a couple of other questions. Maybe I should mention that the Institute of Cultural Inquiry still have a website, which is still on, right? And so eventually, for whoever is interested in discussing these topics more, there's the way to reach out to you through the website, correct?
Yes, there's an
Yes.
active email there. The website is a little bit dormant right now as we're reorganizing. But the
Mhm.
press is still active.
Right, right. Wonderful. So that's it for today. Thank you again, Antoinette and Deborah, for being here with us today and to share your experience and your work. I hope you all enjoyed and that you will have a chance to follow more events from the Circa Festival as well as from the GRI. And thank you all, the participants, and be well.